As you know, I wrote a book in 2011 called The Most Important Thing. And the reason it has that title is because I would find myself in my client's office and I would say, you know, the most important thing in investing is controlling risk. And then 5 minutes later, I would say the most important thing is to buy at a low price. And 5 minutes later, I would say the most important thing is to act as a contrarian. And so back in 2003, I believe, I wrote a memo called The Most Important Thing. I listed 19 things, each of which was the most important thing. And then I used that. I couldn't think of a better format for my book, so I used the same format in 2011. Interestingly, some of the things are different. And that's just supposed to show you that one's thinking should still be alive. Fooled by Randomness by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. Now, who here has read that? All right, more people than have read my book. I think it's very important. In investing, there's a lot of randomness. And if you look at investing as a field without randomness, where everything is determinative, you'll get confused because you will not draw the proper inferences from what you see. For example, just a brief example, you see somebody and they report a great return for the year. The scientist who thinks that the investment world runs like the world of physics might think, well, great return, that means the guy's a great investor. But in truth, it might be somebody who took a crazy shot and got lucky. Why? Because there's a lot of randomness in the world. When I went to Wharton, 1963, the first book I remember learning was called Decision Making Under Uncertainty by C. Jackson Grayson, who became, as I recall, America's first energy czar. And I learned a couple of important things from that book. Number one, that you can't tell from an outcome whether a decision was good or bad. It's very important. Most people don't understand this. Totally counterintuitive. But the truth is, in the real world where there's randomness at work, I mean, if you build a bridge and it falls down, then you must assume that the engineer made a mistake. That it was a bad decision to build the bridge that way. But in the real world of where there's randomness, good decisions fail to work all the time. Bad decisions work all the time. The investment business is full of people who are, quote, right for the wrong reason. Made a bad decision, it didn't work out the way they thought, but they got lucky and they were bailed out by events. So this is very important, and this is the basic theme of Fooled by Randomness, Taleb's first book. Since then he has written the Black Swan, which became more famous, but I don't think it's as good a book, and he's written a book called Antifragile, and that one didn't get famous. But I think that this book is something everybody should read it if you have an interest in numbers, investing, and how the world works. So it's, as I say, the book is all about the role played by luck. And basically, even if you know what's most likely, many other things can happen instead. This is very, very important. And the reason we don't have many probability distributions that look like this, but rather that look like this, is because a range of things can happen. There's a professor at the London Business School who put it succinctly. He said, risk means more things can happen than will happen. And this is, again, this is profound, in my opinion. In the economic world, people generally make their decisions based on something called expected value, which is to say that you multiply every possible outcome. First of all, of course, you don't think in terms of a single outcome. You think in terms of a range of outcomes. So you take every, if you could iterate over so many, you take every possible outcome, you multiply it by the likelihood that it will happen, you sum the results, and then you get something called the expected value from that course of action. And you choose your course of action based on the highest expected value. And that sounds like a totally rational thing. As I lived my life, from learning about Dimson, learning about Taleb, from learning from my own experience, I realized that does not equal will. Lots of things that should happen fail to happen. And even if they don't fail to happen, they fail to happen on schedule. So the thing that the economist or the financier thinks should happen this year may happen in 3 years. You got to live 3 years to see it happen. One of my favorite sayings is, never forget the 6-foot-tall man who drowned crossing the stream that was 5 feet deep on average. We can't live by the averages. We can't say, well, I'm happy to survive on average. We got to survive on the bad days. You got to survive, and if you're a decision maker, you have to survive long enough for the correctness of your decision to become evidence. And you can't count on it happening right away. I always remind people, overpriced is not the same as going down tomorrow. And if you bear that simple truth in mind, I think it helps. So Taleb and the role of luck, very important. Then John Kenneth Galbraith. John Kenneth Galbraith, for those of you who are not familiar with ancient history, was an economist, American economist. He was a little on the left side. He was, somewhere between free enterprise and socialism. But he was very, very smart. But he wrote some very good books, and one of them is called A Short History of Financial Euphoria. And one of the things he says is we have two classes of forecasters, the ones who don't know and the ones who don't know they don't know. Now, I don't believe in forecasts, macro forecasts. People who forecast interest rates, performance of economies, performance of stock markets. And I don't think that my efforts to be a superior investor and most other people's are aided by macro forecast. Am I saying that the forecaster is never right? No, I'm not saying that. The forecasters are often right. Last year, GDP grew 2%. Many forecasters forecast that GDP will grow this year at 2%. That's called extrapolation. And usually in economics, extrapolation works. Usually the future looks like the recent past. So usually the people who forecast a continuation of the current are right. The only problem is they don't make any money. Most people forecast 2 something for this year. A growth rate of 2 something is cooked into the prices of securities today. If the growth rate turns out to be 2 something, everybody who forecasted that will be right. Security prices will not change much because that 2 something growth was anticipated and discounted a year or 2 ago. So all those people who are right won't make any money. So most forecasts, extrapolation works all the time. Forecasts that are extrapolations work all the time, but they don't make any money. Logically, am I saying that forecasts never make any money? No. The forecasts that make money are the forecasts of radical change. If everybody's predicting 2.4% growth for this year, and if I predict -2, and it turns out to be -2, or I predict 6 and it turns out to be 6, I'll make a lot of money. So forecasts which are not extrapolations, forecasts which are radically different from the recent past, are potentially very valuable if they're correct. Of course, they're not of any value if they're incorrect. And if they're incorrect, they'll cost you a lot of money. If everybody else thinks it's going to be 2.4 and you predict 6 and it turns out at 2.4, you're probably going to have taken the wrong investments and lost a lot of money. Deviant forecasts, which turn out to be right, are potentially very valuable, but it's very hard to make them. It's very hard to make them correctly. It's very hard to make them correctly consistently. And somebody at lunch mentioned an early memo I wrote called The Value of Forecasts. In one of those, I reviewed the recent history of the Wall Street Journal poll. Every 6 months, the Wall Street Journal publishes the results of a poll of economists. And on GDP growth, CPI, value of a dollar, the price of oil, whatever it might be, a bunch of phenomena. They do it consistently. And they ask like 30 people consistently over time. So it shows basically that most of the time when people get it right, it's because they predicted extrapolation and nothing changed. Once in a while, something changes radically, and invariably somebody predicted it. But the problem is, if you look at that person's other forecasts over the years, you see that that person always made radical forecasts and never was right any other time. So of course, if you're getting your information from a forecaster, the fact that he was right once doesn't tell you anything. You wouldn't, the views of that forecaster would not be of any value to you unless he was right consistently. And nobody's right consistently in making deviant forecasts. So the bottom line for me is that forecasting is not valuable. We don't know what's going to happen, and randomness will play a big role in what happens. And randomness is by definition unpredictable. Number 3, The Loser's Game by Charlie Ellis. This is very interesting. TRW used to be a big conglomerate, and now it's known primarily for credit scores. And there was a guy named Cy Ramo. He was the R. It was Thompson, Ramo, Woolridge, and he was the R in TRW, and very smart. And Cy Ramo wrote a book, and it was about winning at tennis. Who here plays tennis? Okay, this is good, because as I go around the world now, very few people play tennis anymore. What Ramo said is that there are 2 kinds of winning tennis players. If you look at Pete Sampras or Nadal or Djokovic, how do they win? The winning champion tennis player wins by hitting winning shots. He hits shots that the opponent can't return. They're either so well placed or so strategic or so fast and hard that the opponent can't return them. And if Nadal hits a shot which is not a potential winner, then his opponent can probably put it away because it doesn't have enough difficulty on the ball. So the championship tennis player wins by hitting winners. The amateur tennis player, like him and me, we win not by hitting winners, but by avoiding hitting losers. And we believe that if we can just push it back 20 times and just get it over the net 20 times, our opponent can only do it 19. And we believe that we'll outsteady him, outlast him, and eventually he'll hit it into the net or off the court. We'll win the point. But we'll win the point without having hit a winner. So there are obviously 2 styles of tennis. The same is true for investing. So Charlie Ellis wrote an article called The Loser's Game. He thought amateur tennis is a loser's game. It's won by the people who avoid being losers. He thought that Charlie thought that investing is a loser's game. And so the best way to win at tennis is at investing is by not hitting losers. Now, I believe also that it's a loser's game, not as much as Charlie believes, and not for the same reason. Charlie believes that investing is a loser's game because the market is efficient and securities are priced right. I believe there are inefficiencies. I just think it's hard to consistently take advantage of them, and you have to be an exceptional person to take advantage of them on a consistent basis. The reason that the pro can go for winners is because he is so well schooled and practiced and steady and talented that he knows that if he does this with his foot and this with his hip and this with his elbow and this with his wrist, that the ball will go where he wants. He doesn't worry about miscues, wind, sun in his eyes, distraction. He's so well schooled. And in fact, you know, in scoring tennis matches, they keep track of something called unforced errors. And the reason they keep track of them is because there are so few. The pro doesn't make a lot of unforced errors. We make unforced errors all the time. And so in order to survive, we have to avoid them. So the point is, if you're going to be an investor, you have to decide, am I good enough to go for winners? Or should I emphasize the avoidance of losers in my approach? For us, in investing, especially because there's randomness, if we do the right thing with our foot and hip and arm and elbow, we're not going to get a winner every time.